The Ruy Lopez, also known as the Spanish opening, is one of the oldest and most classical chess openings. It aims to build strong central control while putting pressure on black's knight, which defends the vital a5 pawn. This opening is rich in strategy, leading to deep positional battles and sharp attacking chances for white. Many world champions have used it to demonstrate the perfect blend of logic, patience, and tactical brilliance. Let's start from the very beginning. I'll first share the most fundamental ideas, and then we'll gradually move to more advanced and interesting concepts. So, why does the Ruy Lopez begin with the move pawn to e4? What is the purpose behind it? Well, to launch a successful attack in chess, there are basically two key preconditions. You must develop your pieces and control the center. The Ruy Lopez aims to accomplish both of these goals. With the first move pawn to e4, white immediately occupies one central square and takes control of another, which is practically the best result you can achieve with a single move. In addition, this move opens up the diagonals for both the queen and the light-squared bishop, helping you begin piece development right away. Ideally, if black doesn't try to challenge your central control and plays something passive, white would like to continue with pawn to d4, fully occupying the center and gaining a dominant position from the start. This is like a small milestone, a dream come true. We've taken control of the center. What's the point of that? It gives several big advantages. First, if black wants to develop their knight, you can easily push your pawn forward to chase it away. That's already annoying for black. Also, black cannot easily place their pawn in the center, since it would just be captured. So, if black wants to develop, they often play a more modest move like pawn to e6. While this opens the diagonal for the dark squared bishop, it locks the light squared bishop, making development harder. All of this happens because of your space advantage and control over the center. You now have freedom to develop your knights and bishops however you prefer. That's why controlling the center is so powerful and important. Now, let's take it back to the actual moves of the Ruy Lopez opening. For that reason, black replies with pawn to e5, a symmetrical move that also occupies one central square and controls another. It also prevents white from playing pawn to d4 and keeping two strong pawns in the center. So for that reason, white plays knight to f3, which develops a piece and again takes control of two central squares. Now, the pawn on e5 is under attack. We often say we should centralize our pieces. But why does that matter? Well, think about the knight. When it was back on g1, it controlled only 3 squares. But once it moves closer to the center, it controls 8 squares. Just one move makes the knight almost 3 times more active and powerful. That's the real strength of centralization. Your pieces become far more effective when they are near the center. Black responds in the same logical way with knight to c6, defending the pawn on a5, taking control of another central square and developing a piece. And now comes bishop to b5, the signature move of the Ruy Lopez. For beginners, this move may seem a little confusing at first, but it carries deep strategic meaning. It puts pressure on the knight on c6, which is defending black's central pawn on e5. If you only think about checkmating the king, you might want to place your bishop on c4, like in the Italian game, where it targets the weak f7 square near the black king. Against a beginner, this can work fast, but if your opponent has some experience, this quick attack often fails. For example, if black plays pawn to d5, the diagonal gets blocked, and after pawn takes d5, black continues normally with knight to a5, forcing your bishop to move. If you try knight to g5, it doesn't help. Black can chase your pieces, win back the pawn, and pawn on d5 even start attacking you. That's why early attacks rarely work. Strong development and center control are much safer and smarter. I'm not saying this position is terrible for white, but that quick attack didn't really achieve anything. It didn't win material or lead to checkmate. So, let's go back a bit. After some experience, players realize that attacking the black king too early simply doesn't work. Instead, we must return to the two main principles of a successful attack: development and control of the center. White's plan is clear. First control the center, then develop the pieces properly, and only after that, start a real effective attack. With that idea, the move bishop to b5 makes perfect sense. Since black has just played knight to c6 to control the center, white places the bishop on b5 to attack that knight and increase the pressure. This move develops a bishop, helps prepare for castling, and gives white the possible option to exchange on c6 later, gaining full control over the central squares. You don't have to do it immediately, but it's a strong option to keep in mind. Whenever an opportunity arises, you can do that, thanks to the bishop on b5. If black wants to develop their light-squared bishop by pushing the pawn forward, it creates an unpleasant pin on the knight. That's the logic behind bishop to b5. It supports white's plan to control and influence the center while countering black's play. Then black plays pawn to a6, the most classical move. Its goal is to push the bishop back so it's less annoying. Black doesn't mind a possible trade on c6 because generally a bishop is stronger than a knight, so this exchange favors black. Also, white can't win the undefended pawn on a5, because if white captures it, black plays queen to d4, a strong counterattack against white's knight and pawn. As the knight moves back, black recovers the pawn and gives a check, forcing white's king to move and lose the right to castle. So, white's plan backfires, and the position may even become slightly worse for white. That's why after pawn to a6, white simply retreats the bishop, keeping the same pressure and ideas, maybe to capture later or just hold the tension without trading the knight. The idea behind black's move pawn to a6 is that it prepares pawn to b5 whenever needed, to drive the bishop back completely. Black doesn't have to play b5 immediately, since bishop takes c6 isn't a real threat. That trade favors black. But if the pin ever becomes annoying, black can push pawn to b5 to remove the bishop. Therefore, black continues with pawn to a6. Now black develops the knight to f6, attacking the pawn on a4 and helping control the center. At first, it might seem natural for white to defend the pawn with knight to c3 or pawn to d3, but there is a deeper idea in the Ruy Lopez. As mentioned earlier, white's ideal setup is to occupy the center with pawns on e4 and d4, creating a strong central presence. To prepare for that, white's main plan in the Ruy Lopez is to play pawn to c3, followed by pawn to d4. This is a long-term strategy, not done immediately, but after some preparation, and it helps white achieve complete control of the center. If white plays pawn to d4 right away, it won't hold because black can simply capture it. But if white first prepares by playing pawn to c3, let's say black makes some random moves, then after pawn to c3 and pawn to d4, if black captures, white can recapture with the pawn and maintain a perfect center. This isn't the exact variation, just the main idea behind white's plan. So, coming back to the real position, white avoids moving the knight to c3, because that square is reserved for the pawn to support c3. Similarly, white doesn't want to play pawn to d3, since that pawn is meant to advance to d4 later, and playing d3 would just waste time. Because white doesn't want to defend the e4 pawn with either knight or pawn, white simply castles. It turns out that capturing the e4 pawn is actually dangerous for black. In the future, if white places the rook on e1, it will create strong pressure along the e-file, so black cannot safely win any material there. Therefore, white isn't worried about the e4 pawn and simply castles. In response, black usually develops the bishop to e7. You might wonder, why bishop to e7 and not to the more active square c5? While bishop to c5 looks aggressive, it actually helps white. Remember, white's main plan is to play pawn to c3 and pawn to d4. If the bishop stands on c5, those moves would come with an extra tempo by attacking the bishop, helping white gain time and space. That's why black prefers the safer and more solid move bishop to e7. Now, with the e-file closed, black doesn't fear rook to e1 as much and might even consider capturing the e4 pawn. So, white plays rook to e1 to defend it properly. With the pawn on e4 now secure, white also renews the threat to black's pawn on e5. If black castles, white can exchange the knight on f6 and then capture the pawn on a5 comfortably.